Alright guys, welcome back to the shop. Well, we're going to try to keep chipping away at the list. We've got the mock-up engine all the way back in the car, and we're hopefully going to start working on the last few items that need to get done with this thing in mock-up stage before we can pull this out and finally get to building this engine. Today we're going to work on the cooling system. Got a new fan shroud that we're going to try to mock up, maybe work a little bit on fabricating the rear tins, and then we're going to go ahead and work on the oil drain system, maybe the full flow oil lines, to kind of get everything wrapped up so that we can go ahead and get this thing out and go ahead and get the engine build started. So let's get to work. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the parts. First with the fan shroud. So if you remember originally, when I put the air to water intercooler in, I was using just your standard 36 horsepower shroud, had to profile the back edge and remove the doghouse oil cooler so I could get that to fit in. So my intention was to use that, go ahead and finish doing some fabrication on the back of that shroud to block the air pickup for the doghouse cooler. But you know, maybe that's a little bit less than ideal. Enter the Andrig's Evolution fan shroud here. So this is Andrig's latest offering here for cooling upgrades for the Volkswagen. This is a doghouse style shroud, but it has no oil cooler provisions in it. The real benefit to this over what I was using is that he's really reworked the internals of this shroud to balance the cooling left to right and balance the cooling between the cylinders and the cylinder head. So even though I was able to delete the oil cooler in the 36 horsepower shroud, there was some question in my mind about what did I do to the dynamics of the airflow into the shroud. And so this just kind of gives me a little better peace of mind that this should be more even cooling for the engine. So some benefits of this shroud obviously is that it's got all the vanes inside of it, it corrects the distribution, and gives you 100% of your traditional doghouse fan air to the engine. So obviously this requires an external oil cooler. We were already doing that already, so that's not going to be a problem for us. Overall, I'm happy with the way the shroud is. He says in his ad that it does require a little bit of finished metal work. That's no big issue for me. But today we're just going to try to go ahead and see if mock this up, see how it fits, see if any other issues comes up. He also supplies this nice oil cooler block-off plate with his setup. I actually already have one on the car, so I'm not sure that we'll end up using this one. But I'll be interested to see how this all mocks up and looks in the car. The second piece we're going to work on is the oil drain for the turbocharger. So this is a SCAT 1.5 quart deep sump. Did a little bit of work on it, welding some NPT bungs on there. In fact, shout out to Corey who helped me do that. He's got a little bit more experience welding cast aluminum, so he's able to help me get those welded up. We'll get this bolted on the bottom of the engine, start looking at the turbo drain block and the fittings here, see what's going to work out the best for us. Again, just trying to knock out all those little details. So when this thing comes out, we get the engine built, it just plugs right back in and we're ready to roll. I think that's enough jabbering for now. Let's go ahead and start ripping this thing apart. Let's see what it takes to get this fan shroud put in place. Alright, so it's time to start digging into this thing. You guys, of course, have seen this process a few times in my videos already. Start by taking off the apron, and let me tell you, this removable apron sure is a lifesaver on a turbo car. And you got to deal with all this pipe work around the engine. From there, we'll start taking off all the charge pipes. I think I've also mentioned before, there's a very specific order of operations to get these removed from the car. First, you got to start with the pre-turbo piping, then take off the charge piping between the throttle body and intercooler and turbo outlet. And then from there, you can finally start gaining access to the intake manifold and plenums themselves. Since you've guys seen this process a few times already, we'll go ahead and skip forward to the point where all this is out of the way, and we can go ahead and start working directly on the shroud itself. So we can go ahead and do the test fit on the Evolution shroud. We'll remove this 36 horsepower shroud out of the way. Got to remove the bolts that attach to the cylinder head tin, the alternator clamp, and then the shroud should just lift off and be clear and out of our way. Alright, so here's a closer look kind of behind the scenes here of the shroud, what we've got going on. I think what I'm going to try to do is fit the shroud empty at first. I wasn't actually sure whether I was going to be able to get the existing shroud out with the water lines in the way, but I have just enough room. So I'll try to fit the new shroud before I put the alternator and backing plate on there, just to see how it fits into the tins. But here's just a quick shot of what's kind of going on behind the shroud. Here I mentioned I've already got my oil cooler block off. This one's from Scat. It actually feeds my oil pressure transducers for the gauge and for the ECU up here on this manifold. And the water supply and return lines from the intercooler you can see here, going back down up underneath the car to the cooler, which you can just kind of see back through there. So now it's time to go ahead and see if we can test fit this on the cylinder head tins and the engine bay. Really nothing to this, it's just kind of a wrestling match, trying to work around the cooling tins. Aftermarket cooling tin fit is always sort of challenging. I think these parts are some of the best that are on the market. Overall, this shroud seems to fit up pretty well. The cylinder head tins I'm using are reproductions from Awesome Powder Coat, and so they have a pretty good fit as far as their ears up to the shroud itself. Since this is an aluminum pent roof case, actually the way the Evolution shroud works, I've got nice clearance around the case already. Here you can see I'm sort of wiping the thing down since it's raw and not coated right now, trying to really minimize how many fingerprints I leave and opportunities for this thing to start surface rusting. From there we'll try to start putting in the alternator to see how it fits. And this is about the point where I noticed that the opening in the shroud is basically just a little bit too small for the pilot on this cast aluminum alternator backing plate that I run from CB. So I'm fighting with it here a little bit. I realize that it's not going to work, so back to the bench we go so we can do a little bit of massage work on the shroud to get this to fit up better. So with the shroud fully out of the car, you can get a better look to kind of see what's going on here. And as I suspected, basically the opening of the shroud is just not quite big enough for this backing plate. So before I whip out the die grinder and start working on the shroud, I'm going to go ahead and assemble the fan to the alternator assembly. That way I can make sure that I check clearance for not only the backing plate, but the fan as well. This just makes sure that I only have to do one round of modification in the shroud and I don't fix it for the backing plate and then find out later that I have to do some more work in the back of the shroud for the fan as well. So basically we'll go ahead and buzz this fan on, and then from there we'll get the shroud lifted up and we can go ahead and set the alternator assembly back in place and start checking for clearance. So here you can really kind of get a good idea of what's going on. Basically in the hole of the shroud is just not quite big enough for this cast aluminum backing plate to sit down flush. So there's nothing left to do but to pull out the die grinder and just slowly start working on the shroud. So I warn you here guys, this is one of those things where you really need to go slow, sort of sneak up on that fit. It's pretty easy to take out too much material and sort of make it sloppier than you want, whereas if you sort of take your time, sort of sneak up on it, allows for a nice tighter fit and a better product in the end. So after an iterative process of really working on the fit, I got everything sort of where I want and happy with it. Go ahead and give it another wipe down with WD-40, again trying to keep this thing from flash rusting on me. And then we'll go ahead and set the alternator assembly in and do a final installation of everything so we can put it back in the car and check to see how things fit up now with the alternator assembly bolted up. So I previously modified this backing plate for some countersunk Allen drive screws. Really makes for a nice clean and finished look. So now the alternator assembly is back in, we can go ahead and try to set it back in the car, see how things are going to fit up now. So nothing special with this process, just like usual, you have to wrestle this thing around just to get it to fit in the tins. Kind of looking specifically how the cylinder head tins fit, how the water lines for the intercooler route around the shroud, and then how the alternator sits in the stand itself. Overall fitting pretty well, so we'll go ahead and put the bolts back into the cylinder head tins, put the clamp back on the alternator, and then we can sort of step back and appreciate the work. Alright, so after a little bit of wrestling match, we got it in here. I gotta say, I am pretty impressed so far with the fit up of this shroud. With the way he's got the bottom profiled, plenty of clearance for this aluminum bubble top case, fit into the cylinder head tins themselves, really nice and tight. No big major gaps, so to speak of, other than the fact that I needed to open the fan opening a little bit because I'm using this cast aluminum backing plate, this thing just drops right in. As expected, plenty of room around the back side of the shroud for the intercooler. Essentially, because this is all seam welded, there is no sort of lip here on this back edge like you have on a normal shroud that I had to clearance for the intercooler. It's just one seam on each end, and so this shroud is basically a little bit narrower in thickness than your standard doghouse shroud. So like I said, fit up is really, really good. Don't know what to say other than to say that I'm pretty impressed. You know, when you're messing with aftermarket stuff like this, there's always a little bit of expectation that you're gonna have to do a little bit of finish work on it. But really, this is far easier than I expected as far as fit up. The gaps are nice and tight. I think this is gonna work really, really well. So we'll go ahead and continue to mock everything back up. Of course, I gotta put a hole and a riv nut in the fan shroud here to support the air cleaner inlet piping. But let's go ahead and get all the intake put back on, and let's see how it looks from there. So one other thing that I'll point out before we continue to mock up, you notice here that the shroud looks like it stops short of the cylinder tin on this side over here, right there at that point. There is actually a fill piece. I don't know if I can get a good angle from here, but if you look on the inside of that shroud, you can see there is a fill piece inside here that he attaches the bottom lip. It actually comes up and goes right back to the case. So again, fit up is really, really nice on this. I think compared to sort of a modified 36 horse shroud on top of these aluminum cases, I think this fit up is probably better than that. So here we are again, going ahead and throwing all of the intake system back in place to mock everything up. You guys have seen this a few times already, so we'll go ahead and skip forward to the point where we're putting in the pre-turbo air cleaner pipe and do that last bit of modification for the bolt to support the pipe to the shroud. With everything in place, I can go ahead and mark the shroud where I need to drill the hole for the riv nut. So we'll go ahead and mark that, get the pipe out of the way, use a center punch to get a punch on the shroud, and then go ahead and start with a small drill bit to drill a pilot hole, and then step that up to a large hole size for the riv nut that we need to install. Now we'll use the riv nut tool to go ahead and crimp the riv nut into the shroud. Then from there we can slide the intake pipe back in place, go ahead and throw the bolt in, and get the pre-turbo air cleaner pipe fully mounted up and assembled to the engine. All right, we got everything mocked up and back together. You know, I've had the intake off and on so many times. It's really easy now. I've got it down to a science, exactly what tools, exactly what order everything goes in. Got it all back together, and again, pretty impressed overall with the fit up of everything. As you saw, I went ahead and drilled and put a riv nut in for the air cleaner support, and pretty happy with the way this has come together. So that wraps up that part of the process. We'll work on making some more adjustments to this. I have a little bit more things here I want to change as far as the openings and the fit up here that I'll modify on this template before I transfer it over to metal. But that wraps up this piece of the project. Up next, we'll start working on the oil drain lines to the turbo. So we'll go ahead and start by mocking up this sump on the bottom of the engine here. So this is a Scat 1.5 quart deep sump that I've had for quite a few years. We'll go ahead and get this bolted up so then we can start installing some of these fittings on the sump and on the bottom of the turbo to kind of see what's going to work out best for the turbo drain layout. So with the sump in place, we'll go ahead and turn our attention to the turbo drain. So I'm using this nice little cast aluminum turbo drain block from CB Performance. It's real compact, basically makes a 90-degree turn out of the bottom of the turbo and has a female NPT threaded hole. And what that'll allow me to do basically is route the oil drain above the turbo header. And then inside that block, I will thread in this pipe nipple, which sort of limits the exposure of any of the rubber hose to that really hot area of the header. And then of course we'll terminate into the side of the sump to this -12 AN90 and hose fitting. And it should be a pretty straightforward path for the oil drain. With all that in place, go ahead and grab a piece of hose, sort of looked at the layout of everything. I'm not going to go ahead and install this right now because it's a fairly tight fit, but this gives me an idea of how things are going to work out, and overall, pretty happy with how that's going to work. You saw that orange fire braid there, that'll be insulation that we'll keep on that hose to protect it from the heat, and I think we've got a good solution here. Alright, so I think that'll get us wrapped up here. This is a pretty straightforward setup. So we've got the 1/2" MPT bung welded on the side of the sump to a dash 1290, and then I'll have a hose that runs up and grabs onto this barb here. Really just too tight to try to do an AN fitting up here underneath the turbo. So I've got this stub tube that I'm going to use instead. So it's just a 3/4 inch Parker push lock hose. And of course I've got some fire braid insulation that'll go over it. Essentially this will be probably up at a little bit more of an angle. And so we have a nice downhill path from the turbo outlet down to the sump. While it's here, I went ahead and put in a couple plugs for the extra holes that we're not using. That's just a random 1/4 inch MPT plug here, and then another 1/2" MPT plug on the other bung, as well as the VDO oil temperature sender for the gauge on the dash. So the reason this sump was drilled on both sides is I've actually used this thing in the past and I've had it turned around 180 degrees. So when I welded these new bungs on here for the 1/2" MPT, this allowed me to go in and sort of clean up and optimize the layout for this particular configuration. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for today. Pretty happy with the Evolution fan shroud. Fit up is really nice. I think it's going to work out really well. All that's left now is just to go ahead and get it painted along with the cylinder head tins and get this cut out. Like I said, this is just a template. I'll do some more adjustments and transfer this over to metal. May or may not record that, not sure. But all in all, I'm going to say the cooling tin is pretty well wrapped up at this point. Also, turbo drain, got that sorted out. Sump is on, all the fittings are in place. I got an easy path for drain on it. I'm going to wait and cut the hose until I do the final assembly on it. Just because that push lock hose, it's pretty tight once you put it on that bar, but I don't want to have to wrestle it back apart when I go to pull all this off to get the engine built. So apart from cutting the hose, putting the fire braid insulation on it, and putting the clamp on it, that's wrapped up. So I think at this point we're getting real close. I got a couple little minor things here. Got one more sensor I need to wire in. Maybe the other little few odds and ends here and there. But I think we're just about at the point where we're going to start doing the engine build itself. Hope you like what you saw. If you did, go ahead and like the video, subscribe for more. We're going to keep trying to push forward and hopefully get this thing running pretty soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.